Good day, citizens. Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as I always say, thank you so much for listening. And a happy 4th of July.
The 4th of July, which is the nation's birthday, and it is a celebration that is essentially identical all over the United States. There are coolers, and there are beers, and there are bratwursts, and hot dogs, and hamburgers, and fireworks, and you can go anywhere in America and see fireworks on the 4th of July.
But we don't go there in the show. We talked to President Jefferson this week, and one thing that he has never done, and he did this week, is to read the Declaration of Independence in its entirety.
Pretty amazing. I sat here and read it out at your request. It's a pretty amazing document. I almost never read it. You know the preamble, you know the ending, but then you think, oh yeah, they are quartering troops and stirring up the Native Americans and encouraging the slaves to revolt and taking us across the ocean for our trials, not with juries of our peers, and shutting down our legislatures and so on. You read all that, but you think, okay, blah blah more, yeah, yada yada. But then when you actually sit down,
I never think yada yada.
Oh, I do. But now when I read it out, I thought, wow, Jefferson obviously is writing a propaganda piece.
And he says he did it, the first draft, in a day.
Well, but he doesn't admit this, but he did have one thing to help him, and that was the Virginia Declaration of Rights that had been done by his friend George Mason.
Right. Mason doesn't get enough credit, does he?
And so Jefferson actually had that document, and he himself, Jefferson, had written something called a summary view in 1774 with a list of the crimes of the Parliament and so on. He had that with him. And so Joseph Ellis, our dear friend, who sometimes likes to kind of belittle Jefferson or put him in his place a little, he once said it was a cut and paste job. I don't think that's true. But Jefferson was not doing this out of the mere brain that he brought to the room.
Well, anyway, it was great to have you read the Declaration, as Jefferson, read the Declaration of Independence in its entirety. And it is in the show, but if you are a 1776 Club member, you'll have access to that read, and who knows what good fun you can have with that. And if you'd like to become a 1776 Club member and support the show, go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate. You'll find all the instructions there. We so appreciate your support. It all goes into keeping the show afloat, and we need your help, and we love your input.
David, to prepare for this program, I read a book that has been sitting in my library for 20 years. It's called 4 Days in July by Cornell Lengyel, Lengyel.
I've never even heard of that.
4 Days in July, and it's about the first 4 days of July 1776. And when I read it, here's what I thought. It's so easy for us to take this for granted, but imagine what it felt like to be in that room and to realize what they were doing. Entering into a state of armed rebellion, declaring independence of the greatest superpower on earth, maybe jeopardizing their lives.
That would be the best exercise any of us could do, is to try to imagine that.
That's what I did for the 2 days that I read this. And I want to just read you one little passage from John Adams. He got it. He nailed it. And he had a sense of drama that the much cooler and stoic Jefferson would not have brought to this. And here's what he says. He wrote this to Abigail, of course. He says, "When I consider the great events which are past and those greater which are advancing, and that I may have been instrumental in touching some springs and turning some small wheels which have had and will have such effects, I feel an awe upon my mind which is not easily described." That's amazing.
Yeah, I remember we talked about that with Ellis during the Adams, the First Family book discussion, and that just really struck me too. It's an amazing passage.
In another letter that he wrote to her, he says, I feel like this is what the great men of the ancient world would have wanted to be part of, Lycurgus and Demosthenes and Cicero and Cato, that this is one of those moments that happens once in a millennium, once in 5,000 years. I mean, almost never. I happen to be living at one of the critical, pivotal moments in the history of the planet Earth, and I get to be Cicero, or I get to be Demosthenes or Solon or Lycurgus for America. And he's just so aware of the weight of destiny. And he rose to the occasion. And I think it really is the case. This book really convinced me. And I was reading David McCullough's John Adams too. And it really convinced me that he was right later in life when he said, Jefferson kind of ran away with the revolution by the greatness of his pen, because Jefferson gets so much credit when he really was a relatively minor figure up till that point. He becomes a much more important figure later, but John Adams was like, hey, what about me? Am I chopped liver? I was the guy who brought this all about, and he's just this guy that has a great prose style.
And I'm laughing because, ladies and gentlemen,
that's it.
You may witness the day and the hour when we got public proof that Jenkinson is slipping into Adamsite.
I became an Adamsite. I couldn't ever become an Adamsite, but I do admire the man.
This was really a fun show. Thanks for it. And, I'm so glad we did that show a couple of weeks ago about Common Sense and Thomas Paine, because it's a great lead into this. I mean, very, very different than what Jefferson did, but we know Jefferson read it and was aware of it.
And before we go to the show, let me just turn people back to the Jefferson Watch essay that I wrote.
It's a great essay.
And I want to ask you a question. I want to ask them a question, and that is, so what I said basically was, either you mean it or you don't. And if you mean all men are created equal, then there's a lot that should be very disturbing to us in the way that equality doesn't work for everybody in the world. And some people are born into just unbelievable poverty and chaos and destruction and violence. And yet 30 miles away, you can be born into the upper middle class and so on. So I know that that's like a little bit of a dark cloud on a great day of national joy. But,
no, it's not.
But I think it's important, and I wonder what you think when you hear that, David. That
I
like,
can
wait
tell
a
you
minute.
exactly what I thought. It's true that all men are created, all people are created equal. It's true. It's what we as Americans strive for, but as Americans, we fall short. And what we need are the voices of men like Jefferson and men like you to call our memories to action. How's that?
Well, I appreciate that, of course, and I blush at the idea of being in the same sentence with Mr. Jefferson. But what I do think, David, is I actually woke up in the middle of the night and I thought, okay, I've got to write this essay. And I thought, all men are created equal. All men are created equal. All humans are created equal. And I thought, is that true? And just a few days ago, I had seen one of those ads, those UNICEF ads of the starving child in Africa. And I thought, why is this fair? Why is it fair that that person is not going to live to be 8 and someone born in Boston is going to live to be 108?
If we could sit down with Mr. Jefferson and talk to him about it, I'd say, Mr. Jefferson, why don't you say we are all created equal? And the purpose of America is to further that dream throughout the world.
Well, he meant that.
Yeah.
He didn't realize. I mean, he didn't want to take on too much, but he basically thought that he was writing the mission statement for the rest of human history. And it's turned out it's true. I mean, not to beat up on Jefferson. Of course, it's easy to do, his hypocrisies and so on. But look at this, that when Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Seneca Falls Declaration in the 1840s, she essentially just copied Jefferson and said all men and women are created equal. When Ho Chi Minh wrote the Declaration of Independence for Vietnam, he copied Jefferson's declaration. I mean, Jefferson's declaration is one of the most influential things that ever appeared on earth. And almost every revolutionary movement, from Cuba to Vietnam to the natives of northern Canada, when they decide to announce to the world that they're not going to put up with it any longer, they almost invariably go to the source. It's not the Bible. It's not John Milton. It's not Rousseau or Voltaire. The source for all of this, it's not even the Magna Carta. The source is Thomas Jefferson. And so you think Lincoln was right when he said, look, think what you want about Jefferson, but he launched the most important document ever, and it's never going to be wrested, and we're never going to give up until everyone on earth gets to live according to that set of rights, equalities, and dignities, that we just cannot rest until we extend this thing all the way across.
Very good, sir. Let's go to the show. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is President Thomas Jefferson. Good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, as you know, we're about to celebrate one of the few holidays you celebrated, which is the 4th of July. And I wanted to talk to you a bit about that today.
One of two holidays that I celebrated as president. I celebrated the 1st of January, New Year's Day, because it's an entirely arbitrary point in the calendar. And then I celebrated the 4th of July, which was the birth of the United States of America. Those two, not Christmas, not Easter, not Thanksgiving, not All Hallowed Day, Halloween, but those two secular moments, and particularly the 4th of July. And as president, I threw open the doors of what you call the White House and invited the people of the District of Columbia to come for punch or tea or wine, sometimes champagne, and what you would call hors d'oeuvres on that occasion.
Mr. President, I'm not sure how many Americans in my time have actually read this document, and or how many did during your time. I'm wondering if I could prevail upon you, sir, to read the Declaration of Independence to us, sir.
I'm happy to do it. I don't regard myself as a proper orator, but I do know the rhythms of the thing.
Excellent. Let's proceed, sir.
When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriation of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for the introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must, therefore, acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all the other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Excellent, Mr. President. Thank you. Any thoughts some 200 years later on the document itself?
I stand by what I wrote. There are really several parts of this. There's the preamble, the famous preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident and so on. And then there is the list of the crimes and follies and bureaucratic mistakes of the British Ministry, the Parliament, and indeed King George III. And that's the substance of the thing, because we were trying to justify our revolution to a candid world. And then finally, after all that, I go ahead and say, well, we have no choice now. You forced us to declare independence, and so we are now pledging to be a new country, and in doing so, we realize we're putting our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor on the line. So it was really a three-part document.
I have a number of questions. I'd like to know how you wrote it and how it was circulated and published. And also, sir, if you would share, I would like to know the fate of some of the 55 other men who signed it.
I'd be happy to talk about that part of the story that I know.
Well, let me ask you one quick question. How long did it take you to write it, sir?
Well, I wrote the first draft in a single day and then set it aside and tinkered with it for a few days thereafter. But essentially, I wrote it in a single afternoon.
We need to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson, right before we took our break, you said you wrote the first draft of this in a single day?
That's correct. I was staying in a boarding house on Market Street in Philadelphia, and I had been on this committee of 5 which were asked to draft this document, and the other members deferred to me. Several left the committee altogether, and that left John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and me, and they both asked me to make the first attempt. And so I did this. I was reluctant to do it because I looked at both of them as superior. Franklin because he was the greatest writer of all of the American people, and famous for his capacity as a diplomat, our finest scientist. I mean, a pure man of the Enlightenment, Dr. Franklin. And John Adams, although not of the same capacity as Franklin, was more important, I think, in the Revolution. He was almost the spark of it when everyone else was reluctant and diffident and overly cautious. It was Adams, through those months up to the moment of the Declaration of Independence, who was pushing the representatives from the 13 individual colonies to swallow hard and to break with Great Britain. And probably nobody did more to bring about the moment when we voted on the 2nd of July to declare independence. Probably nobody did more in that respect than John Adams. So I felt like a very poor third in that subcommittee, but I did have a reputation for being a very deep student of the history of liberty and human rights, and I also was thought by others to be an excellent prose stylist. And so for those reasons, knowing that I would be subject to revision by better men, by Franklin and by John Adams, I agreed to take a stab at it.
you say you were a student of liberty. Certainly, you must have given this a great deal of thought, being able to write a draft of this in one single day.
Well, the Enlightenment, which is that European intellectual and social movement that began in the 17th century and culminated in the early 19th century in Scotland and France and England, to a certain degree in Germany and Italy also. The Enlightenment had awakened us to the fact that humans are born with rights. It's not that we didn't have some inkling of this, but it had been sort of lost in the business of everyday life and the social hierarchies that existed and the institutional basis that was deeply rooted in European culture. And suddenly all these Enlightenment thinkers are stepping back and saying, well, in a state of nature, what would it be like? How are governments formed? From what impulses have they evolved? Do governments have a natural resonance with the deeper harmonies of the universe, or are they arbitrary? Are they just something that happened arbitrarily in this country or in that country? How did kingship begin? Does someone who's born have rights, or are rights granted to people by benevolent governments? How do people change their society if they regard it as unjust in one way or another? All of these questions were being examined by John Locke and D'Holbach and Rousseau and Dr. Johnson and a whole range of people in Scotland and England and France and Germany and Italy and so on. And for the first time in human history, there was a really intense body of growing literature about this, and rational literature. For the first time, we were asking these questions and to a certain degree answering them without reference to God. For most of the history of Western civilization, when people thought about life, they thought about it through a lens that was theocratic, that was based in an understanding of God's providence and God's omnipotence. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that lens, but there are other lenses that are perhaps more useful. And so the Enlightenment was in many respects a secularization of culture, and the Enlightenment asked these very fundamental, I suppose you'd call them radical questions about the nature of life and the nature of government and human nature, and gave us confidence. So when I sat down to write this, I wasn't writing it as if I'd been kept alone in a room for the first 33 years of my life. I had been very fortunate in my education. My father was a reader and had a library of about 40 books, and they were good ones. And I started reading very early, and then I was tutored by Scots clergymen in my district in Western Virginia. Then I went off to the College of William and Mary, where I met my two mentors, first William Small of the Scottish Enlightenment, and then George Wythe, the great self-taught Greek scholar and jurist. And all of them were putting books in my hands. Books were becoming available in an unprecedented way. They were less expensive, more available. And so I was fortunate. I lived at a moment when the book was exploding as an artifact, as a delivery system for ideas. And I came from a family that prized education, and I was extremely fortunate in my mentors at the College of William and Mary. And so by the time Franklin and Adams turned to me, isn't that I had read everything in the Enlightenment, but I had read an enormous amount, and I could then digest some of that from John Locke and Bolingbroke and Rousseau and Voltaire and others. I could digest some of those ideas that were widely circulating in my time into this document. So I later said, and I meant, I consulted neither book nor pamphlet. I just sat down and took out a sheet of paper and a good quill and sharpened it and wrote what I thought was the common sense of the subject, what any well-educated American might have written on this occasion.
I understand how you went about writing it and the knowledge that you already had to use. I'm curious, sir, how did this document get circulated? Was it published? And probably more importantly, what was public reaction to it?
There was a debate in the Continental Congress about its contents, which I found excruciating because as the author of the thing, of course, I was devoted to it and believed that it was the right document.
Yes, no author likes to get edited. Is that correct, sir?
That is correct. And Dr. Franklin was sitting next to me during this long and protracted debate, and he told me a tedious story about a hatter and a sign and trying to cheer me up. But I couldn't be cheered up. I thought they were mangling the draft that I had presented to them, and I couldn't speak to defend it because that's not what a Virginia gentleman does. So there was this long debate, and finally on the 4th of July, about 11 a.m., the members of the Continental Congress voted unanimously to adopt it with all the changes that had been made. About a quarter of it was changed. And then my fair copy, I had been making notes on the emendations on my copy, and then it was taken by me by the secretary of the Continental Congress, and he presented it. There were no copying machines at this time. He presented it to a printer by the name of Dunlap, and Dunlap stayed up all night setting it in a broadside. So let me explain to people of your time what that means. So I had this handwritten document with squigglings and scratchings out and things carroted in and so on, marginal bits. It goes to this printer, Dunlap. Then he takes it and he gets a frame, a wooden and metal frame, and he starts taking out pieces of type. So we hold these truths to be self-evident. Capital W, you put in the frame, small e, and then a space, and then H, O, L, D. Each one of these pieces of type is the size of an ant, and it's pulled out of a frame, a box of type in which the alphabet divides each letter, placed upside down and backwards in this frame. And when he finishes, this took the whole night. When he finished setting it, then he tightens the frame and puts it on a platen on the press, and then takes ink and dabs this large ink blot in ink, and then rubs it and pounds it all over this type. And then he lays a huge sheet of paper on top of that type, and then goes to the press and he pulls with all of his might, and the paper is then pushed down onto that inky type, and it creates the image. And once that's done, he very carefully lifts the page up off of the type and uses the equivalent of clothespins to put it up on a string. And then he reads it, because there will have been mistakes in a document of that size, setting type in the way that we did even by experts in my era. There would be mistakes, and then he would go back where a word was misspelled, or a capital was used when a lowercase should have been used, or italics was used where Roman should have been, and then he would replace that type and then make a second proof copy. And if that one proved to be correct, then he would lock it all up and then start to produce them. And he would produce them in batches of 20, 30, and 40, each one requiring the same business. Put down a sheet of paper, pull the press, remove the press, take the paper off, and hang it up to dry. So each of these is hand printed on this press. And in the course of that night, he set it all in type and produced, 40 or 50 or 60 copies. But he couldn't do them fast enough. And so for the next few days, he kept making more and more and more of them, because the demand for them, not only by the people of Philadelphia, but the people around the country, was huge. So members of the Continental Congress would get a few copies, and then they would fold them up and seal them and send them back to their constituents in Georgia or New Hampshire or Rhode Island, and they would hope that the constituents would show them around or hang them up in post offices, but often they would have to send 5, 10, or 30 of such copies so that they would make sure that they disseminated correctly all over the country. Well, then the next step would be for newspapers around the country to print them. And so the first one that was printed was in a Philadelphia newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, which produced the whole front page, all of the Declaration of Independence on the 5th of July. And then that paper would be carried or sent around the country, and other newspapers would then copy it for their local constituents.
My understanding from previous conversations with you is that the majority of Americans wanted to be able to reconcile with Britain and avoid war.
That's correct.
Did this document, the Declaration of Independence, convince people that the list of grievances was too much, it was time to do this, or didn't more work need to be done?
Much more work needed to be done. When people read it around the country, I think they thought, well, we've done it. The Congress has done this thing, and now we have to live with it. I mean, it was a little bit too late at that point to debate. And I didn't write it really for the people of the United States. I wrote it for the world so that we could justify what we were doing. You know, revolution is a very grave thing. And
Certainly.
as I said in the Declaration, people would prefer to put up with abuse and corruption and bad government as long as they can possibly endure it, because that's preferable to the chaos of an armed rebellion or revolution. And so we had exhausted all the means of peaceful redress of grievances, and we finally were forced into a state of rebellion by the king and the parliament and the ministry. I wanted to do two things with the Declaration of Independence. I wanted to convince the world, thoughtful people everywhere, that our cause was just, that we weren't just a bunch of anti-tax hotheads. And I wanted to, if possible, convince the French and other nations to recognize us. You know, a new nation needs to be recognized and to have a formal diplomatic establishment and bills of exchange for trade and so on. And I thought France was our best chance, and Dr. Franklin, of course, helped to get us recognized by the people of France.
I would certainly like to speak to you, Mr. President, about some of the men who signed it, the 56 signers. I look at the list and notice that the two states that had the most delegates sign were Virginia and Pennsylvania. Could you share with us some recollections about some of the men who signed it? Perhaps we could start with the gentleman you mentioned earlier, Mr. Hancock.
Well, he was the president of the Continental Congress. He was a rich man from Boston. In fact, he had participated as a terrorist in the Boston Tea Party, but he was such a dandy, he was a very well-dressed man, that people who witnessed the Boston Tea Party said they could see, they were dressed as native peoples, as Indians, but they said they could see his lace cuffs beneath the disguise that he was wearing as a Native American. He had so wanted to be the commander-in-chief, and he was bitter when George Washington was nominated instead by John Adams. And he never fully got over that, but he did, when the moment came, he stepped up and signed in a large way. I should say that the signing did not occur on the 4th of July. That's an American myth. It didn't occur until the 2nd of August and later. But when he signed in the boldest possible way, partly because that sort of was the nature of his ego, but it also was the case that he wanted to show all the rest of us that he was not afraid for his name to be legible. In a certain sense, when we signed this thing, we could have been signing our death warrants. You know, if we had tried to remain anonymous and just publish this without anybody taking credit for it, we might have been able to slip away from the noose of the British authorities if the revolution had failed. But by signing it, we were essentially saying our lives now depend upon the success of this revolution, and we probably would have been tried. Some would have been beheaded. Some might have been hanged as common criminals if the British had won. So he started it, and he said, now George III won't have to wear spectacles in order to see my name. So that was the first one.
And Mr. Hancock, if I recall correctly, was from Massachusetts. Are there any other delegates that you recall that you'd like to speak about?
Yes, but let me say first a few things by way of statistics. Of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, 24 were lawyers, 11 were merchants, 9 farmers. There was 1 teacher, 1 musician, and 1 printer. That, of course, would be Benjamin Franklin. 12 of the signers later had their homes ransacked and burned. 9 of the signers fought and died from wounds that they received during the revolutionary cause. 5 were captured and tortured by the British. This was a pretty brave thing that people were doing, and not the majority, but certainly a large number of the signers had their lives effectively destroyed by this. I can think of a few. So Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island had the palsy, and he came up onto the dais to sign. He was using a hickory cane, and his hands were trembling, and he said this. He said, "My hands tremble, but my heart does not." And I remember when Benjamin Harrison of Virginia, he was obese. He was a huge man. And he signed, and he turned to Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, and Gerry was just a tiny little man, thin as can be, and short. And Benjamin Harrison said to Gerry, if we hang over this, I'll have the great advantage over you because I'll die almost instantly. But you, as a little man, will bounce around for a long time before you die.
Perhaps
some gallows humor.
Right.
Caesar Rodney of Delaware had skin cancer. His face was disfigured, but he came and he had a green silk scarf placed over half of his face, not in shame, but because he was deathly ill at the time. But all of us felt we must own what we had done. We must take responsibility, and we needed to encourage each other and encourage all of the people in the rest of the country that the cause we had chosen was the right one. By the way, George Washington was not one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence because he was off in New York City trying to save us from the British invasion, which was occurring at precisely the same time. But George Wythe, my beloved mentor in law and the great self-taught Greek scholar, was one of the signers. And Richard Henry Lee, he's important because he's the one who on the 7th of June first proposed that we declare independence. He's the one who offered the resolution that we would be now free and independent. And it was tabled for a long time because the Congress was, at that moment, not quite ready for all of this. And finally, not from Virginia, but Francis Hopkinson is important. Hopkinson was a musician, but he's also the designer of the American flag.
Mr. Jefferson, I thank you so much for taking the time to read the Declaration of Independence for us today, and I thank you for the conversation. Right now, sir, we need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson, and now our weekly conversation with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And a happy 4th to you, sir.
Happy 4th to you, David, and to everyone who is a friend of the Thomas Jefferson Hour and everyone who is a citizen of the United States. Happy 4th of July.
Every year we do a 4th of July show on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and this was a pretty interesting one. There was no talk about fireworks and beaches and brats and all that kind of stuff. It was pretty serious with Mr. Jefferson this week.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, we have never done a program on the other signers.
Right.
And, there are lots of mythologies that float around about this. I once had a public quarrel with K. Ross Perot, if you can imagine it, in Dallas. And he stood up at a performance that I was doing and said, half of them were tortured and their families were thrown off their land and their farms were burned and their cattle were killed. And I said, I don't really think that's true, Mr. Perot. And he said, it is true, and you're wrong. So as you know, there's a whole mythology about this,
really
about the suffering. And
yeah.
Some of it is true and some of it is not true. But we know that, and even the stories that I told today about Benjamin Harrison saying to Elbridge Gerry, you're going to dangle a lot longer than I am, and so on. Historians like Joseph Ellis and David McCullough say, well,
maybe
we don't
not,
have
yeah.
we don't have explicit notes. What happens around an event like this, and one of the most monumental moments in human history, certainly one of the most monumental moments in American history, is that a whole series of recollections and memories and embellishments and apocrypha attached to those stories. Some of them have the same status as George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, that no basis in fact, and some of them are partly based in fact, and most of them have been touched up and embellished, and we just don't know. One of the things that Jefferson was so upset by is that nobody in the Second Continental Congress was trying to keep a verbatim record of the transactions. So John Adams, for example, I think it was the 3rd of July, gave what David McCullough says is the greatest speech of his life, 4 hours, to defend the Declaration of Independence and to push the delegates to make the fatal vote. We only have some very basic summaries of that great speech. Jefferson said, if somebody had had a polygraph or a recording device of some sort, we'd have this definitive history. We just don't. And so in all such cases, as you know, David, mythology begins to creep in. And as historians, we like to question some of that. You don't want to be sour about it because some of these stories are terrific. On the other hand, people on the spot are not usually as witty as they turn out to be when history looks at them 200 years later. And, Franklin has said that at one point in the signing, someone turns to Dr. Franklin and says, he's like reading over the document with his spectacles and says, well, don't just hang there. And then Dr. Franklin turns and famously says, well, if we don't hang together, we are certain to hang separately.
And I so want that to be true.
Is it true? We don't know, but what a great thing.
The other one of Franklin's that I so want to be true is a republic, madam, if you can keep it.
I think that one is likelier to be true from 1787 when he was leaving the Constitutional Convention and a woman said, well, what have you produced? And he said, well, a republic, if you can keep it. That sounds like Franklin. My point is that history is always partly mythological. And if we actually had a recording device, if someone discovered that there was, remember that year we did a program on this, that
right.
there are vibrations and so on. But say we had suddenly a recording of the whole thing, we might come away pretty disappointed.
Oh, I hate to think that.
But it could be.
Yeah. But you're right, though. There are a lot of popular myths, and one needs only to Google, and you find almost the exact verbiage on tons of sites. That thing about 5 signers were captured by the British as traitors and tortured.
And some of it could be true and some of it is not, but there's a lot of martyrdom of the K. Ross Perot type, like these men, they had the right stuff and we no longer do kind of thing.
I searched to my best ability and found that there was only one guy who was specifically taken because of his status as a signatory, and that was Richard Stockton of New Jersey.
And he was beaten almost to death and died early because of it.
Yep, taken to a jail like a common criminal. But anyway,
let me. You said we've had no fireworks. Let me give you my favorite moment.
And I thought we were going to get.
I do every year. John
joking.
Adams on this. John Adams wrote to Abigail, and of course he believed that the 2nd of July was the big day, and the 4th was just the news release.
He never really let go of that, did he?
No, and I can't either. This is what he says to her because it's so right. He nailed it, but he just got the day wrong. He says to Abigail, the 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. That's exactly what we do. We just do it 2 days later on the 4th of July. So he was right. He was a brilliant man, and he was actually right about this too, that the 2nd of July is the day they all stepped up and voted for independence. The 4th was just the day they adopted Jefferson's Declaration of Independence.
I really enjoyed listening to Mr. Jefferson talk about how it was printed. These are the Dunlap broadsides that he was talking about?
Yes.
And looking that up, the last one that was found was a previously unknown copy, and it was sold for over $8 million in 2000.
Because at the time it was just like a Twitter feed, So imagine if this happened today. So it'd be live coverage,
yeah.
but then it would be out within seconds. And think what we can do. So in his time, I gave you that sort of painstaking. Take the T, take the H.
I love that.
E.
My father was an amateur printer, had an 1890 Chandler and Price in the basement, and I used to go down there and watch him set lead type. You can see that in, what's that movie, The Post.
And I did this when I was a young man. I worked for the Jenkinson, North Dakota
you know
Press.
All yeah. I mean,
and so
really,
it was great. Yeah. It was a great era, but it was so slow. And so today, you tap this thing out. You might even have voice recognition software. It goes out instantly, and today it would reach 1 billion people within 2 hours.
Another instance where technology has wiped out a craft.
But it wiped out a craft. But of course, Jefferson said in his lifetime, he said, the fact of the book means that tyranny is on the wane and liberty is on the rise, because now that the book is cheaply reproduced, we can smuggle it into all of the repressive regimes on earth. And once people read the truth, they will never live with tyranny. Imagine how the internet, Twitter, and FaceTime and so on could be used as forces for enlightenment, and they are to a certain degree, if we really wanted them.
Yeah, and it would have been harder for people to edit Jefferson's draft. I looking, they made 86 changes to it.
And
it just had to kill him.
It did kill him. And most of their changes were right, even taking out the famous anti-slavery charter, which was the last of his indictments of George III. He said he has waged war against human nature itself by vetoing our attempts to do this, and et cetera. Everyone knew that when the responsibility for slavery was meted out, it wasn't really going to stick with George III. He might have played a little role in the perpetuation of the slave trade, but slavery is really on us, on the American people, so they pulled it. They pulled it. And
it never would have been ratified or passed.
Georgia and South Carolina said, no, we're not doing it if you keep that. And then some personal stuff. Jefferson made he talked about the last spasms of consanguinity and loyalty. He over-personalized the divorce, and so the members of the Continental Congress toned that down some, and they added famously, with the protection of divine providence. Jefferson did not have in the famous ending the protection of divine providence, and the members of the Continental Congress inserted that somewhat to his chagrin, because he believed that this is a very human thing.
Great conversation this week, and I know you will join me in wishing all Americans a very happy and safe 4th of July. And now, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So Thomas Jefferson wrote 242 years ago. It is self-evident if you think about it. According to Scientific American, 150 human beings are born somewhere on Earth every minute. In the eyes of God, or from the perspective of the planet Jupiter, a human is a human, whether she is born in Berlin or Bombay, Cairo or Cambridge or Calcutta, Manhattan or Madrid or Mexico City. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 heart, 2 kidneys, fingernails, hair, a brain, a belly button, a unique capacity for language. As Shakespeare's Shylock puts it, hath not a person eyes, hath not a person hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? Both President John F. Kennedy and George W. Bush, to take 2 quite different examples, said that every human being wants the same basic things: food, shelter, clothing, the rule of law, a respect for basic rights, and basic opportunity. On January 6, 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously spoke of the 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. I remember reading the United Nations Declaration of Rights incised on the high wall of the magnificent new Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, Manitoba, not long ago. The museum designers clearly felt that the rights and dignities articulated in the UN Declaration of Rights were so universal, so irrefutable, so obvious if you think about it, that they must be blown up and inset into the walls of the museum itself to make sure that everyone who ever walked through those doors had to have a visceral encounter with the self-evident truths of human aspiration. I bought a poster of the Declaration as my only souvenir. If this is true, that all men are created equal, why do we see those UNICEF and Oxfam Africa relief ads on television showing 3-year-old children with distended stomachs and flies perching on their lips and eyelids? Those children were randomly born into the world, just as a child in Omaha, Nebraska is, or Santa Monica, California. And yet any rational person knows that the child of Omaha has an infinitely higher chance of living a full, comfortable, and secure life than the child of Upper Volta or Uganda. If this is true, that all men are created equal, why does a person born Nez Perce, born Hidatsa, born Cherokee, born Navajo, born Shoshone, born Crow, born Cheyenne, have an unmistakably harder time getting her basic needs met in life than someone born 100 miles away in an Anglo-American community? And of course, the whopping 4th of July irony is that this continent where Anglo-Americans thrive once belonged to the Crow, Cheyenne, and Shoshone for centuries, for millennia, before Columbus bumped into the Western Hemisphere and touched off a series of holocausts that are not yet over. I know people in Bismarck, North Dakota, but I could be speaking about Denver, Colorado, or Spokane, Washington, who are aware that the Native Americans who live near us have a higher infant mortality rate, a higher suicide rate, a higher likelihood of dying in violence than the other human being born just a dozen miles away, the same human being as seen from the planet Jupiter, living in the same bioregion. And to these irrefutable facts, the white folks of Bismarck merely shrug. If this is true, that all humans are born equal, why did we just learn, to the consternation of many, that young women who compete in what is self-styled as the most significant women's scholarship program in the world, the Miss America pageant, will now no longer have to strip to near nakedness and strut around in front of 25 million people to win that scholarship? Imagine for a moment if men competing for the Rhodes or Marshall or Wilson or Fulbright scholarships had to parade in public in Speedos or a G-string in order to win that opportunity. For that matter, if this is true, why is it that a woman randomly born in Yemen or Iraq who is raped by a stranger may be killed by her father to preserve his honor? Maybe Jefferson was just wrong. Lovely, high-minded words, an agreeable fiction, but one that has no basis in the facts on the ground. As Jefferson wrote those glorious and revolutionary words in a boarding house in Philadelphia, 256 miles to the south, about 8 days' travel under the conditions of his time, gangs of his 200 black slaves were hoeing his tobacco fields back home and baking bricks for his neoclassical Palladian mansion and cleaning the privies for his white wife and his white young children. While he trimmed his quill and let some of the greatest words in the English language glide through his pen onto paper, a black mother gave birth at Monticello to an infant who was born into slavery, not born equal, born permanently a species of property that the enlightened Mr. Jefferson could buy or sell, whip or caress, shackle or slap, rent out, or even kill with legal impunity. We all live with some contradictions, but that would seem to be an insurmountable one. If Jefferson and other slaveholder revolutionaries really meant those words, said Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine and Joseph Priestley and Richard Price and Benjamin Rush, Jefferson would have had to find a way to free his slaves, because if he couldn't or wouldn't free his slaves, he must not really have meant what he wrote in the famous preamble of the Declaration of Independence to have universal application. He must instead have been speaking about his own club, his own tribe, his own fraternity. All humans are not born equal, because it depends on where you were born and, unfortunately, what color you were born into. That if you got to choose and you wanted to thrive on earth and not suffer for everything you ever achieved, you would really want to be born white, male if possible, in Western Europe at the very least, and in America if you could make that happen. That from the view of the UN Declaration of Rights or FDR's Four Freedoms, you would not want to be born black or brown in a second or third world country or on an Indian reservation. Just think about the implications of that. But we don't get to choose where we are born and to whom. You are just randomly born, just as a daffodil is randomly born, or an oak, or a cockroach, or an ant. The great human aspiration, never more clearly or beautifully articulated than by my hero, Mr. Jefferson, is that you will not be punished or rewarded by the accident of your birth. You may not remain equal very long in life. Someone is a better sprinter. Someone is a better student of calculus. Someone is better at selling stocks and bonds. Someone is luckier in love. But you are at least born with an equal chance at thriving, or at least subsisting comfortably with a living wage on earth. That's the ideal. For Jefferson, it was not too much to dream about. And I say, as the 21st century creates economic opportunity unprecedented in the history of the planet, is that too much to ask? On this 4th of July, have a conversation about the preamble of the Declaration of Independence with the people around you. And let us know what you hear. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.